Imagine everything you've been told about knights in shining armor and heroic battles is a carefully crafted lie. The reality was far darker, a waking nightmare of mud, blood, and sheer human misery. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on medieval warfare, not from the perspective of kings, but through the eyes of the common man who had no choice but to fight and die in them. This isn't a story of glory, it's a story of survival against impossible odds. Let's begin with how you, a simple farmer, would have found yourself in this situation. You didn't volunteer. You weren't a noble knight dreaming of valor. You were a peasant, tied to the land. And one day there was a knock at your door. It was the local lord's official, backed by armed men, there to deliver a simple, terrifying message. You've been drafted. This was your feudal obligation. Your life, your family, your crops waiting to be planted, none of it mattered. The Lord needed bodies for his army, and you were now a body. That was the only math that counted. The system was brutally efficient. Every man deemed able-bodied, typically between the ages of 16 and 60, owed military service. In your village, the official had a list. Sometimes it was based on records. Other times, it was a random, pointed finger. You, and you. Your opinion was not requested. Let's say your name was called. You now had 3 days to report to a gathering point with whatever weapon you could find. The penalty for refusing? At best, you would lose your land, leaving your family destitute. At worst, you would be hanged. Often it was both. Hanged as an example, and your property seized to ensure the lesson was learned. You might think about running, hiding in the woods, or fleeing to a distant town. But in a world without anonymity, where every soul in a small village knew each other, that was a fantasy. And if you did manage to disappear, your family could not. Collective punishment was the bedrock of medieval law. Your wife would be turned out of her home. Your children could be forced into servitude. Your parents or brothers might face punishment in your place. The system was designed to make the consequences of running far, far worse than the consequences of fighting. In battle, there was a slim chance you might live. If you deserted, you condemned everyone you loved to suffering. So you went. You arrived at the mustering point to find hundreds of other men with the same hollow look in their eyes, a mask of resignation barely hiding pure fear. Some were your neighbors. Others were strangers from villages you'd never visited. You were expected to form a shield wall with these men, to trust them with your life, though you had never met them before. A tiny fraction of this gathering were professionals, men-at-arms and knights who had trained for war since childhood, or mercenaries who fought for pay. These men, maybe 1 in 10, looked upon the rest of you with open contempt. You were not fellow warriors. You were mobile obstacles, human shields meant to absorb the enemy's first blows. The gear you brought was a sad testament to your station. You had no armor. A proper mail shirt cost more than you could earn in years of backbreaking labor. Plate armor was a fantasy for nobles. You wore your everyday clothes, a linen shirt, a wool tunic, perhaps a leather jerkin if your trade provided one. Some men stuffed their shirts with straw or rags, a pathetic attempt at padding that might, if God willed it, slow down a blade. The truly desperate wore cooking pots on their heads, tied on with leather straps. It looked ridiculous, but a ridiculous helmet was better than a split skull. Your weapon was likely a farming tool repurposed for war. The march began, and with it, a new dimension of suffering unfolded. Armies didn't teleport to war. They walked for weeks, sometimes months, across landscapes that were as hostile as any enemy. A typical day meant covering 15 to 20 miles, a distance that sounds manageable until you consider the conditions. You were already malnourished, carrying everything you owned on your back. Your weapon, a bedroll that was little more than a thin blanket, a sack of stale food, a water skin, and if you were incredibly lucky, a spare pair of shoes. 20 to 40 pounds of gear, a crushing burden for a body already weakened by a life of hardship. The roads were a testament to decay. The magnificent stone highways of the Romans were long gone, their stones stolen for local buildings, their paths reclaimed by nature. You marched on dirt tracks that were barely recognizable as paths. When dry, they were rutted and strewn with ankle-twisting rocks. When wet, which was often in the damp climate of northern Europe, they transformed into rivers of thick, sucking mud. This wasn't ordinary mud, it was a greedy, boot-stealing mire that could be knee-deep. Every step was a battle. You'd plant your foot and the mud would clutch at your boot with an almost sentient hunger. Pulling it free required genuine effort, and sometimes the mud won. Your foot would come out, but your boot would stay behind, buried in the filth. Now you faced a choice. Stop the entire column behind you to dig for your boot, earning the curses of hundreds of men, or continue marching with one bare foot. Most chose to retrieve the boot, because walking barefoot on these roads was a death sentence in slow motion. You'd hop back, plunge your hand into the cold, wet earth, fish out your now mud-filled boot, and hurry to catch up, your wet foot freezing as you stumbled forward. This happened repeatedly to everyone. Your footwear, those thin leather peasant shoes, began to disintegrate after just a few days. The stitching unraveled, the soles separated, the leather cracked. You'd try to repair them at night with needle and thread, but the conditions made it hopeless. By the second week, many men were walking barefoot, their shoes having completely given up the ghost. The consequences were swift and brutal. Bare feet developed blisters within hours. Those blisters popped, leaving raw, open wounds. Those wounds, pressed into mud teeming with animal dung, human waste and every kind of filth imaginable, became infected. Within days, feet would swell, turn red and ooze pus. The infection would spread, red streaks crawling up legs as sepsis set in. There were no antibiotics. Men died from foot infections on the march, not as a rare tragedy, but as a regular occurrence. They would start limping, then stumbling, then they could no longer walk at all. And when they fell, the army did not stop. It marched on, leaving them by the roadside to die alone. The weather was a fickle tormentor. Campaigns happened in the so-called warmer months, but warm in medieval Europe was a relative term. Rain was frequent. Your wool clothes, the only ones you had, would soak through, becoming heavy, cold sponges that pulled heat from your body. You'd march shivering, unable to get warm, and sleep in those same wet clothes at night. Hypothermia could kill you even in summer, your body's core temperature slowly dropping until you collapsed into a final, shivering sleep. When the sun did beat down, particularly in southern campaigns, the heat brought its own miseries: heat stroke, dehydration, and sunstroke. Men's minds would cook inside their skulls, leading to confusion, aggression, and then unconsciousness, often followed by death. And then there were the insects. A massive, moving army was a paradise for flies, mosquitoes, and lice. Flies swarmed in thick clouds, drawn by the smell of thousands of unwashed bodies, the latrine areas that sprouted wherever the army stopped, and the rotting food. They would land on your face, crawl into your mouth and nose, and lay eggs in any open wound you had. Mosquitoes bred in the stagnant water along the route, emerging at dusk to feast, their bites itching maddeningly and quickly becoming infected when scratched with filthy hands. But the true plague was lice. Everyone had them. They lived in the seams of your clothes, in your hair, in your beard, laying hundreds of eggs. Their bites were a constant maddening itch, and the broken skin from scratching became gate. The camp that formed as you neared the battlefield was less a military installation and more a vision of hell itself. After weeks of marching, you were finally ordered to stop, but the respite was a cruel illusion. This was where the army would coalesce, or more accurately, fester, in the days before the fight. Thousands of men were crammed into fields with no sanitation, no infrastructure, and no understanding of hygiene. The stench was beyond anything you had encountered on the march, a thick, palpable miasma of human misery. Where did men relieve themselves? Anywhere. Designated areas formed naturally at the camp's edges, but these were not latrines. They were simply open pits where waste accumulated in reeking, fly-blown piles. The smell of thousands of men's filth, rotting in the sun, mixed with the ever-present mud, creating a foul soup that clung to your clothes and filled your nostrils. At night in the darkness, men would stumble just a few feet from where they slept to empty their bowels. You would wake in the morning to find that someone had defecated next to your head. Disease thrived in this environment. Dysentery continued its relentless harvest. Typhoid fever, another waterborne killer, spread rapidly. Respiratory infections passed from man to man in the close, damp quarters. The progression could be shockingly fast. A man coughing at breakfast could be feverish by midday, delirious by evening, and dead by dawn. The bodies had to be dealt with. Early in a campaign, there might be attempts at mass graves, but as exhaustion and death tolls mounted, even this basic dignity was abandoned. Corpses were dragged to the edge of camp and left to rot, adding the sweet putrid scent of decomposition to the already unbearable air. This human tragedy was accompanied by a chaotic circus of camp followers. They trailed the army in numbers that could rival the soldiers themselves. Wives, merchants, blacksmiths, priests, thieves, and prostitutes. They created a shadow economy of their own, a desperate, opportunistic world, living off the army's suffering. The merchants were often as dangerous as the enemy, selling rotten food at inflated prices and offering usurious loans to desperate men. The prostitutes, living in appalling conditions with no rights or protection, offered fleeting comfort and spread a different kind of plague through venereal diseases for which there was no cure. At night, the camp transformed into a lawless, flickering landscape of firelight and shadows. Men gambled away their few possessions, and drunken brawls erupted over nothing, a violent release for the fear and frustration boiling inside everyone. Your belongings would be stolen in an instant if you didn't guard them constantly. You formed small protective bands with men you thought you could trust, but these alliances were fragile, born of necessity rather than loyalty. Through it all, you tried to prepare mentally for the battle, a task as hopeless as your physical preparation. You checked your crude weapon over and over, sharpening the blade, tightening the grip, knowing it was inadequate. You looked at the knights and men-at-arms, existing in a different world entirely. They slept in tents, ate real food, and their servants maintained custom-fitted armor that cost more than your entire village. They looked at you with indifference or contempt. You were a tool, a piece of human scenery for their drama of honor, and you were utterly disposable. And then the scouts returned. The enemy was close, just a few miles away. The orders were given. The battle would be tomorrow. As the sun set on what might be your last evening alive, a different kind of dread set in, colder and deeper than the fear of the march. This was the night nobody sang about in the ballads. No tapestries were woven, depicting the collective terror of thousands of men realizing they were probably going to die. The air grew thick, with the sound of desperate prayers and quiet sobbing. Lines formed for confession. Hundreds of men waiting to whisper their sins to harried priests, desperate for absolution before they faced their judgment. Men who hadn't spoken in years embraced, mending old grudges, confessing petty thefts and hidden hatreds to their comrades. They couldn't die with that weight on their souls. You tried to eat, but food turned to ash in your mouth. Your body, sensing the impending danger, rejected sustenance. The smell of vomit from anxious men mingled with the camp's other foul odors. Some men, the few who were literate, dictated letters to scribes, messages to wives and children that would most likely never be delivered. You lay down on the cold, rocky ground, but sleep was impossible. The fear was a physical presence, a cold stone in your stomach. Your heart hammered against your ribs. In the darkness, your imagination ran wild, picturing the battle in horrifying detail, a sword splitting your skull, a spear tearing through your guts, being trampled into the mud by a warhorse. Some men lost control of their bowels from sheer terror, and no one mocked them, for everyone understood. Desertion attempts peaked on this night. Men would try to slip past the sentries into the welcoming darkness, but the guards were doubled, their orders clear. Stop deserters by any means necessary. Those caught were dragged back to be made an example of in the morning. The threat of a shameful public execution was the final chain that bound you to your fate. To run meant death and disgrace for your family. To stay meant a chance, however slim, of an honorable death. So you stayed, not from bravery, but because every path led to horror, and this one was at least socially acceptable. You lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of an army facing its mortality, and you prayed. Not the rote prayers of the church, but desperate personal pleas. Please let me survive. Let me see my family again. Please don't let me die tomorrow. As the false dawn began to lighten the sky, the camp stirred with a grim, sleepless energy. The horn sounded, the drums began their ominous beat. The command was shouted across the field. Form up! The waiting was over. The battle was now. How does a terrified mob of farmers transform into a fighting formation? The answer is as chaotic and violent as everything that came before it. The command to form up was less an order and more a chaotic eruption of controlled panic. Sergeants and veterans waded into the mass of men, screaming in multiple languages, physically shoving and beating people into something that vaguely resembled a battle line. You were hurled into position, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, your heart hammering so violently you could feel it in your teeth. The professionals took the front and the flanks, their faces set in masks of grim determination. You, the levy, were packed into the center and rear. Your purpose was to add weight, to be a human bulwark, to die so that the better-armed men could win the day. The formation was claustrophobically tight. You were locked in place by the bodies around you, a wall of trembling humanity. The spacing was intentional. A dense formation was harder for cavalry to break, but it also meant you were trapped. If the man in front of you fell, you had no choice but to step forward into the gap. There was no room to retreat, no room to maneuver. You were a cog in a terrible grinding machine. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the lingering stench of the camp that clung to everyone. Some men were already vomiting from terror, the sound of their retching adding to the symphony of dread. All around you, whispered prayers rose like a ghostly chorus, a desperate lifeline to a God who seemed very far away. Across the field, several hundred yards distant, the enemy was performing the same terrifying ritual. They were a dark, shifting mass, a bristling wall of sharpened steel waiting for you. War cries began to echo from both sides, thousands of voices merging into a single deafening roar meant to bolster courage and terrify the opposition. Banners bearing the colors and saints of various lords waved above the formations, the only visual anchors in the sea of confusion. Then the war drums started. The deep, rhythmic pounding vibrated through the ground and into your very bones, sinking with your frantic heartbeat. This was the final agonizing wait. You stood there, your legs trembling uncontrollably, your grip on your spear so tight your knuckles were white. You tried to remember the pathetic village training, thrust, hold the line, don't break. But it felt like a child's game compared to the reality before you. Then the command came. Advance! The line lurched forward, a single groaning entity. Walking in formation was nearly impossible. The ground was uneven, churned by previous armies and littered with the debris of old camps. You stumbled over rocks and roots, your mouth dry as dust despite the morning's ale. With every step, the enemy line grew larger, resolving from a distant mass into individual men. You could see their faces now, or what wasn't covered by helmets. They looked just as terrified as you were, a realization that offered no comfort. A terrified man with a weapon was unpredictable and desperate. As the distance closed to a few hundred yards, the archers began their work. If your army had English longbowmen, the sight was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. First, the creak of hundreds of bowstrings being drawn taut. Then, a sound like a giant's exhale as they were released simultaneously. A dark cloud of arrows rose, blotting out the sun for a moment, before beginning their deadly descent. You watched them arc toward the enemy formation, then heard the distant, sickening thuds as they found their marks, striking shields, armor, and flesh. Screams pierced the air from the enemy ranks. Men fell silently or writhed with shafts protruding from their bodies. But their line kept coming, and then your side's archers fell silent, and you saw the answering cloud rise from the enemy. For a split second, it was a beautiful, terrible sight. Then reality crashed down. The sound was a storm of impacts. Arrows thudded into shields, tore through leather and wool with wet, ripping sounds, and found human targets. The man 2 ranks ahead of you took an arrow through the neck. One moment he was there, the next, a yard of wood was sprouting from his throat, blood spraying in a crimson arc. He made a wet, gurgling sound, clutching at the shaft before collapsing. The men behind him had to step over his twitching body. An arrow slammed into a shield right beside you, the force of the impact staggering the man holding it. Another found a thigh, and the soldier screamed, falling to the ground where he would be trampled. An arrow grazed your own shoulder, a sharp, burning line of pain. The formations kept advancing through the steel rain, the drum beats intensifying, the war cries growing louder to drown out the screams of the wounded. The distance closed relentlessly. 100 yards, 80, 50. The front ranks lowered their spears, creating a deadly, bristling hedge. You were close enough to see the rust on an enemy helmet, the determined snarl on a man's face, the fear in another's eyes. 30 yards. Both lines broke into a run, accelerating toward the collision. 20 yards. 10. The noise became a single continuous roar of thousands of voices, pounding feet and clattering armor. 5 yards. And then, with a sound that was less a crash and more the world tearing itself apart, the two lines met. What happened in that first second of impact defied all description. It was not a series of duels, but a cataclysm of crushing force and sudden, brutal death. The front ranks were annihilated in an instant, and you were swept forward into the bloody chaos. The moment of impact was not a clash, but a compression. The two lines didn't so much meet as they were violently fused together by the momentum of thousands of bodies. The sound was a sickening cacophony of splintering wood, shattering bone, and a collective scream that was ripped from the lungs of both sides. The front rank ceased to exist as a coherent line, becoming a tangled, screaming mass of the dying and the trapped. You, in the second or third rank, were hurled forward by the press of men behind you, slamming into the backs of the men in front, who were in turn being crushed against the enemy. Suddenly there was no room to move. You were caught in a suffocating press, a human vice where the pressure was so immense that men in the very front were literally squeezed to death, unable to expand their lungs to breathe. Their faces would turn purple, their eyes bulging, as they died standing up, pinned in place by the bodies around them. This was the reality of melee combat. It wasn't about skill or swordplay. It was a brutal, primitive shoving match where the goal was simply to push the other side back. Your weapon, your spear, became almost useless in the tight confines. You couldn't swing it. You could only stab weakly forward into the writhing wall of enemy bodies ahead. You thrust your spear blindly into the chaos. Sometimes it met resistance, the jarring impact of hitting a shield, the tougher give of leather armor, or the sickening soft slide into flesh. You felt it all through the wooden shaft, the initial pop of skin giving way, the easier glide through muscle, and the horrible grating vibration as the point scraped against bone. The man you stabbed might scream, or he might gasp silently, his body going limp. Then the relentless pressure of the crowd would push his body aside, or pull your spear free, and you would thrust again into the new face that replaced his. There was no time to think, no room for mercy. It was a mechanical, brutal cycle, stab, retract, stab again. The ground beneath your feet was becoming a nightmare. It was no longer earth, but a churned paste of mud, blood, and entrails. The dead and wounded formed a slippery, shifting carpet. You were no longer walking on ground, but on bodies. You'd step forward and your boot would sink into something soft, a stomach, a face, a chest. Sometimes the body underneath wasn't dead. A wounded man would grab at your ankle, trying to pull himself up or pull you down into the mire with him in his death throes. You had to kick him away or step on his hands, his head, anything to maintain your footing and stay upright. To fall here was to be trampled into the mud, your own body adding to the gruesome footing for others. The noise was a physical assault, a wall of sound that left no room for thought. It was a hellish orchestra of screaming, battle cries, death rattles, shrieks of pure agony, and the desperate calls for mothers and God. Underneath it all was the metallic clang of weapons on armor, the wet, meaty thuds of blows finding flesh, and the splintering crack of spear shafts breaking under stress. The air grew thick with a fine red mist kicked up by the struggle, mixed with the dust of the field, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. You were fighting in a cloud of other men's blood and breath. You felt impacts on your own body. A sword blade glanced off your shoulder, tearing through your tunic and leaving a stinging line of fire. A hammer blow from the side cracked into your ribs, and for a moment you couldn't breathe, the pain so intense you saw stars. An axe caught the top of your poorly protected head, splitting the skin and sending a warm torrent of blood down your face, blurring your vision. But the adrenaline, that primal drug, muted the pain, turning it into a distant, manageable throb. The full horror of your injuries would wait for later, if there was a later. Your entire world had narrowed to this: the press of bodies, the need to keep stabbing, the struggle to simply draw breath, and the desperate animalistic will to survive for one more second. How long could this human grinding machine continue before something, somewhere, finally shattered? The breaking point was coming, and when it did, the true slaughter would begin. The breaking point, when it came, was not a single event but a cascade of failures. It started as a subtle shift in the pressure, a slight yielding in the enemy's line that was felt through the press of bodies before it was seen. Perhaps a noble's banner, a crucial rallying point, wavered and then toppled. A rumor, born of panic, rippled through their ranks faster than any command. The flank is broken. The commander is dead. Whether it was true didn't matter. Fear did the work of 1,000 swords. The fighting withdrawal became a retreat. The retreat became a rout. And in that moment, the battle transformed from a brutal shoving match into a one-sided massacre. The enemy's formation dissolved before your eyes. Men turned their backs, throwing down their heavy weapons and shields to run faster. The unified roar of combat shattered into the terrified screams of individuals fleeing for their lives. This was the moment the cavalry, held in reserve for this exact purpose, had been waiting for. The ground began to tremble as the war horses charged. The sound of their hooves built from a rumble to a thunder that drowned out all other noise. The knights lowered their lances, and the pursuit began. This was no longer a battle, it was a hunt. A running man is an easy target. The cavalry swept into the fleeing mass, and the wet, crunching impacts of lances striking backs were unmistakable. Men were lifted off their feet and hurled aside like rag dolls. The heavy destriers, trained for this, trampled everything in their path, their iron-shod hooves crushing skulls and breaking bones with casual brutality. The foot soldiers, including you, now joined the chase. The fear and rage of the last hour found a release. It was easy, safe work to run down a terrified, unarmed man. You caught a stumbling soldier, stabbed him in the back with your spear and moved to the next one. There was no honor in it, no glory. It was systematic, efficient slaughter. The field, already a charnel house, became an abattoir on an unimaginable scale. The killing continued for miles. Exhausted men who had fought for their lives minutes before now ran for them, their bodies giving out as terror-fueled adrenaline faded. They were cut down in ditches, dragged from streams, and cornered in copses of trees. The knights took wealthy-looking prisoners for ransom, but for the common soldiers there was no such value. Mercy was a luxury no one could afford. A quick blade to the throat was more practical than taking a prisoner who would need food and guarding. You saw men on their knees, hands raised, begging for their lives in languages you didn't understand, only to be struck down without a second thought. The pursuit only ended when the killers grew too exhausted to continue, or when the fleeing soldiers reached some form of sanctuary, like a dense forest where horses could not easily follow. When the horns finally sounded, calling for a recall, an eerie silence began to descend, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the calls of carrion birds already circling overhead. The battle was over. You had survived. But as you stood there panting, your body trembling with exhaustion and spent adrenaline, the reality of the aftermath began to dawn. The field was a tapestry of horror, a landscape of the dead and the dying so vast it defied comprehension. And now a new kind of scavenger emerged onto this gruesome stage. The camp followers descended, and their business was not killing but looting. The true price of survival was about to be counted not in courage, but in cold, hard plunder. What would you do when faced with the spoils of this victory, gathered from the corpses of men who had been just like you? The looting began before the last enemy had been run down. It was a grim, practical necessity. You weren't paid a soldier's wage. Your compensation was whatever you could strip from the dead. The camp followers were the professionals, moving with a chilling efficiency that spoke of long practice. They worked in teams, swarming over the field like carrion insects. First, weapons were taken. A decent sword was a fortune in your hands. Then, armor, even if dented or bloodied. A mail shirt could feed a family for a year. Clothes and boots were pulled from corpses, the latter especially prized after the march had destroyed your own. The search was methodical and merciless. Purses were cut from belts. Hidden pockets in tunics were slit open. Fingers were examined for rings. If a ring was stuck, the finger was often chopped off to save time. The dead were rolled over, their mouths pried open to check for coins hidden under tongues. Nothing of value was overlooked. You joined in, your survival instincts overriding any lingering revulsion. You saw a dead man with boots better than your own, their leather only slightly scarred. You pulled them off his lifeless feet, your hands slipping in the blood that pooled around his ankles. You took a knife from another, its blade sharper than your spear point. This wasn't theft, it was redistribution. The dead had no need for these things, and your need was desperate. You looted your own side's dead without a second thought. The man from your village who had marched beside you, who had shared his rations, you went through his possessions with the same clinical detachment. His family would never know what happened to his belongings. Better his knife in your hand than in the hand of a stranger, or left to rust in the mud. The camp followers were even more ruthless. They would approach wounded men, those too injured to move but still alive, and rob them clean. If the wounded man protested, a quick knife across the throat solved the problem. It was not personal. It was simply the most efficient way to conduct business. The nobles and knights were the grand prizes. Their ornate armor, engraved swords, and fine clothes were worth a king's ransom. Their bodies were carefully stripped by men who knew the value of every polished plate and jeweled hilt. These items would be claimed by the high-ranking soldiers or the lords themselves, to be sold or kept as trophies. For you, the spoils were humbler, but no less vital. A better pair of shoes, a serviceable axe, a purse containing a few small coins. These small treasures meant the difference between returning home with nothing and returning with something to show for the nightmare. But as you stuffed your gains into a sack, you had to be constantly vigilant. The same men who had fought beside you hours before would now rob you in a heartbeat if they thought you had something valuable. Trust had evaporated the moment the battle ended. You clutched your sack tightly, eyeing everyone around you with suspicion. The field, now stripped of its movable wealth, was left with the final terrible problem: the bodies. Thousands of them, naked and pale, lay scattered under the sky. The stench of death was already rising, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of the throat. Flies descended in black, buzzing clouds. This was a plague in the making. Sometimes mass graves were dug, vast pits where bodies were tossed in layers and covered with lime and soil. But often there was neither the time nor the energy. The corpses were left to the elements and the scavengers, the wolves, the dogs, the crows, who would pick the bones clean. The field would remain poisoned for years, a place where farmers would later turn up skeletons and rusted metal with their plows. The victory was complete, but as you stood there amid the spoils and the rotting dead, a hollow feeling settled in your gut. The battle was won, but the war for your own future was just beginning. How does a man carry the weight of this day and the plunder in his sack all the way home? The army began to dissolve. The bonds of command and shared purpose that had held you together snapped like rotten twine. The knights and nobles gathered their retinues and their valuable prisoners, turning for home with the clatter of hooves and the jingle of harnesses. For you, the common soldier, there was no organized return. You were simply dismissed, left to find your own way back across 100 miles of unfamiliar, often hostile countryside. The journey home was another campaign, fought alone against hunger, injury, and the ghosts that now walked beside you. Your body was a testament to the battle. The cut on your shoulder was inflamed and weeping. The blow to your ribs sent a sharp stab of pain through you with every deep breath. You walked with a pronounced limp, the wound in your leg pulling with each step. There were no surgeons, no medicine. You had your plunder, the sack containing a dead man's boots, a better knife, a few coins, but it felt like a hollow prize. Every item was a heavy reminder of where it came from. The journey was a mirror of the march out, but now you were alone, or in small, wary groups of other veterans. You couldn't trust them. The man who shared your fire one night might slit your throat for your sack of loot the next. You slept in ditches and under hedges, constantly cold and wet. You foraged for berries and stolen turnips, your stomach a constant, aching void. The roads were watched by bandits who knew disbanded soldiers, carried weapons and whatever spoils they had managed to grab. You avoided villages where you could, knowing the locals saw you not as a returning hero, but as a dangerous, unpredictable vagrant, a reminder of the war that had bled them dry. You were a ghost, moving through a landscape that had no place for you. And then, one day you saw it, the familiar outline of your village against the sky, the thatched roofs, the field patterns you knew by heart. A profound dread settled over you, heavier than any fear you had felt on the battlefield. The man who had left this place was gone. You returned gaunt, hollow-cheeked, your body a map of scars, your eyes holding a distance that hadn't been there before. Your wife embraced you, her tears of joy mingling with her shock at the stranger she held. Your children stared at you, frightened by this grim, limping man who had replaced their father. The village had not changed, but you had. The petty disputes and local gossip that had once seemed so important were now meaningless. You'd seen thousands die for causes they didn't understand. How could you care about a boundary dispute or the price of grain? The nightmares began immediately. You'd wake screaming, drenched in sweat, the sounds of the battle, the screams, the clash of steel, the wet thud of your spear finding flesh, echoing in your ears as if you were still there. A slamming door would make you jump, your heart hammering as if cavalry were charging. The smell of blood, even from a slaughtered pig, would transport you back to that field. You tried to return to your old work, but your body was broken and your spirit was shattered. The patience needed for planting, the focus for a craft, was gone. You were quick to anger, snapping at your wife and children over trivial things. The community treated you differently. You were marked. People were wary of the violence they sensed, simmering beneath your surface. Some veterans found solace in the tavern, drinking to quiet the memories. Others turned to banditry, using the skills the war had taught them. You simply endured, a haunted man in a world that had moved on without you. The war was over for the kings and the chroniclers, but for you it would never end. You had survived the battle, the march, and the journey home, but the true cost was a peace you would never again possess. The price of a medieval war was not paid in gold or land, but in the silent suffering of the common soldier, a debt that echoed long after the last sword was sheathed. If this journey into the forgotten reality of the past has given you a new perspective, a deeper understanding of the true cost of history, then consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleepy Owl. We delve into the stories that lie beneath the legends, honoring the truth of those who came before us. Thank you for listening. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams untroubled by the ghosts of battles past.